Well, good afternoon, everybody. Rachel tells me I've got to use this machine here, so I'm doing it right away. So I've used it, right? That's advertising my book that came out with Graham Murdoch and Gordon Maitland last year. So if you don't have a copy of that and you still want to know more after my talk, I suggest you go find one somewhere, either in the library or put one in your library. This business, don't we? There we go. Who's been to one of my talks before on Auckland's volcanoes? Only a couple of you, okay. So this isn't the normal talk I give, it's quite modified because Rachel asked that I try and turn my presentation round to fit in with the exhibition upstairs, and so we've called it The Shape of Auckland's Volcanoes. So we're looking at how do we recognise Auckland's volcanoes, what shape do they have. So early on, before Europeans arrived, of course Maori recognised many of the volcanoes of Auckland. How did they do it? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it'll be they recognised them by their shape to a fair degree. The first map of Auckland's volcanoes, you all know who produced that, don't you? Charles Heafy in 1860. You can see his map over here. He recognised and maps 62 volcanoes in Auckland. Charles Heafy was not a trained geologist, he was just a layman. Came to New Zealand 1839 with the New Zealand Company, and he managed to recognise and map most of Auckland's volcanoes that we still recognise today. He did get a little bit of experience perhaps on how to recognise them when he accompanied Diefenbach, the geologist who visited New Zealand in the 1840s, and he accompanied him up to the Bay of Islands, for example, where there's a similar volcanic field to Auckland. So perhaps that gave him some insight into what made a hill a volcano or not. And so this is Heafy's work. Then, of course, we all know Hochstetter's map of Auckland, the second map of the volcanoes in 1864, produced with the help of Heafy, of course, who accompanied him for some of the time when he was here in Auckland in 1859, and built this map up on Heafy's original. Of course, it's far more professional. Hochstetter was a trained geologist, and he got his training in Germany, where he learned quite a bit about volcanoes very similar to Auckland's in the Eiffel field in Germany, and many of Auckland's volcanoes are similar, and he managed to recognise all these ones that he's mapped in here and mapped them here, and perhaps recognised a few that aren't volcanoes as such as well. So if it's not erupting, how do we recognise what a volcano looks like? And particularly, in this instance today, what is the shape of an Auckland volcano? So all of you would perhaps say, well, the typical Auckland volcano is a volcanic cone, like this one here. It's fairly steep-sided, like this, but how do we know it is a volcano? So in Auckland, there used to be about 33 volcanic cones. 12 have been completely quarried away, but we still have a number of them in pretty good condition. And we can see 3 examples here, for example. The volcanic cones, to help us understand their shape, we should look at how they were formed. All the volcanic cones of Auckland were produced by one style of eruption, lava fountaining or fire fountaining. And we have it illustrated in a diagram here that was prepared for the Volcanoes and Giants exhibition here in the museum in the 1990s. Now, the magma that erupts Auckland's volcanoes comes from deep down beneath us, 60 to 80 kilometres beneath us. It's molten rock at what sort of temperature? Do anybody know? In degrees centigrade? Guess? 1,000 degrees, perfect. 1,000 degrees C, and it's coming up as molten rock, but not only is it molten rock, it's got a lot of dissolved gas in it. Can you think of a molten liquid or a liquid that's got a lot of dissolved gas in it? Nobody can think of a liquid that's got dissolved gas in it. It doesn't have to be molten then. Coca-Cola, yes, okay. Beer, champagne, yes, lemonade. All have got gas dissolved in them. You look at them in the bottle, you can't see the gas, can you? You take the lid off, maybe shake it a bit, and it's under pressure, and all that gas comes out of solution and starts to froth up, doesn't it? The same here. As that molten magma comes towards the surface, as it gets close to the surface, the pressure is released, and the gas, mainly CO2 and water vapour, comes out of solution, is released, and it starts frothing. And it's coming up through the narrow neck, like the narrow neck of the Coke bottle. When you shake it with your thumb over it, fountains up, doesn't it? Same here. The frothy magma fountains high through that narrow neck, high in the air as frothy lava. As that frothy molten lava goes through the air, it cools and solidifies, and it lands as a frothy rock. What's the name of a frothy rock? Oh, well done. There's some scoria there. Do I have to turn this on now? Oh, shit. This is going to take forever, isn't it? There you are, there's scoria. We can turn it off. Oh, she says I can even do this. Oh, look at that. Don't know how. Oh, focus itself, does it? So that's, you don't need scoria passed round, do we? Everybody knows what scoria looks like. So that's the scoria. The scoria lands near the vent and builds up the cone, layer upon layer, gradually getting a larger and larger cone. So that's how the cones of Auckland, the volcanic cones, they're all made of scoria, all produced by this fire fountaining or lava fountaining, the escape of the gas. Here we see an actual example of lava fountaining in Hawaii. You can see it coming up here molten. As it gets through the air, it's starting to cool, and it changes colour as it solidifies into the reddy black scoria, which is landing on the ground here. You can see the wind blowing it in one direction. And here's just an example of the loose layers of scoria, quite loose, they're not welded together, and that's why they were so easily quarried away. This is what the next eruption in Auckland might look like, with a bit of fire fountaining there in the Mangere arm of the Manukau Harbour there. So if you live at Mangere Bridge, maybe now's the time to look for somewhere else. And here's an example of it in Iceland. Lava fountaining here, producing the scoria, starting to bury the houses. The sort of thing that might happen in Auckland in the next eruption. So what do these cones look like? They all have about the same slope, because it's the angle of rest of the scoria as it rolls down the hill. And generally, if you look at all of Auckland's cones, you'll find the angle is close to 30 degrees. So that Auckland's volcanic cones have a 30-degree slope on the outside. Of course, they've been modified by the pre-European Maori earthworks. And if they've got a crater, it's usually about the same slope as well. And many, but not all, have one central crater, as we can see here with Mount Eden. Of course, Mount Eden appears to have, which button do I push? Is it this one? Oh, look at that. So there's the crater there, and there's the scoria cone that was built around that vent. But in fact, Mount Eden extends right out here, north-south elongated. In fact, there used to be another centre somewhere in here, and that crater has been modified and filled in partly by the later eruption from this centre, but also by the building of a reservoir in this area in here. So not all of Auckland's volcanic cones are a single cone with a single crater. They may be complex. They may have had more than one vent that's produced more than just the one circular conical cone. They may have other vents as well. Here we have Motukoria, or Brown's Island. Beautiful example of a steep-sided fire fountaining crater here, as you can see here. And you can see some bumps around the base of the cone here, which are also made of scoria and probably produced either by unidirected fountaining, where the wind blew it to land just in a heap here or here at times, or some of it may, as I'll show you in a minute, been rafted away from the central vent at an earlier stage. Here's another example of a cone in Auckland, Mount St John, with just the one crater, as you can see here, and it's got most of the scoria ramparts here on the eastern side, and not so high ramparts on this side. Why do you think that might be?
Chlorine.
No, that's a good answer, but no, I don't believe so. Wind is the one, yes. So we blame wind for that. A lot of the wind in Auckland comes from the southwest, and quite likely it was coming from the southwest to a fair degree for the week or so that this scoria here built up. Here's another of Auckland's cones, Mount Mangere, and it's got two craters. It's got one larger crater here. It's got a little mound on the inside there, the plug that's been forced out, and a smaller, deeper crater here in the scoria cone. So there's another variation. Another one with two craters was Mount Roskill. Anybody recognise Mount Roskill? This is in about 1940, I think. And here's one crater. It's been filled into a fair degree there. And there was a smaller, earlier crater here that got partly filled in by the fire fountaining out of this younger centre, and some of the scoria would have filled in that earlier crater there. Why don't we recognise it? Because it's been modified. as you can see down here, the reservoir was put in the crater, excavated out here on the main crater back in about late 50s. Exactly. Did you help build it, did you? Okay. I won't say well done. But a lot of people rely on that water, of course. And another one, this is Mount Wellington. It's got 3 craters, so it had 3 different vents from which the fire fountaining or lava fountaining came. Here's one of them here, another one just here right next to it, and there was another one just round the corner here, which again is partly filled in by a water reservoir. How big? 10 million gallons, right? So Heafy, when we look at his map, I find in fact that he mapped and recognised 30 volcanic cones. And in fact, apart from down in the bottom corner down here at Ellet's mountain area, Mangatakitaki Atuatau, where he hadn't visited, I think in fact it probably says there not examined, it says down there in Heafy's map. Apart from missing them exactly down there, he got all the others of our major scoria cones in Auckland. And Hochdetter's map, again down here, he did visit this area and he's plotted them in quite accurately down in here. And he shows them far more precisely. So the scoria cones on Hochdetter's map are all shown in this bright red colour, representing the scoria cones. He's even put in place the craters on top of them, as you can see there. And if we look at a modern contour map, this is produced by LiDAR, by the Auckland Council. It's available online. And if you go online and zoom in enough, you actually get down to 50 centimetre contours you can get from that LiDAR contouring. This is, in fact, anybody tells me up there what it is. Anybody reading my slides will discover it's Rangitoto. And this is the scoria cone of Rangitoto. You can see this is the central crater here, 205 metres at the base, 255 at the top, so up to 50 metres deep, the crater on Rangitoto. This is the scoria ramparts going around it here with higher points in 2 places. And then we can see the slopes going down here, 155, so it's over 100 metres high, that central scoria cone on Rangitoto. So that brings us to the map we have of Auckland's volcanoes 5 years ago, largely produced after a lot of work around the city with excavations and drill holes in the last 100 years and brought together by Les Commode, where we recognised 48 volcanoes, which was extended to 49 by Allen and Smith when they decided to recognise Little Purchase Hill here in Mount Wellington as separate from Mount Wellington itself. And the pink here are the volcanic scoria cones that Hochdetter recognised. We haven't eliminated any that Hochdetter recognised, and we haven't added any to what Hochdetter recognised in the scoria cones. But in addition to the scoria cones, we have these 3 here, Rangitoto, One Tree Hill and McLennan's Hills, that have a wide extensive lava flow field around them, producing what we call shield volcanoes. Here's One Tree Hill then, what we talked about a minute ago. It's got 3 separate craters, as you can see here, produced by the lava fountaining and the scoria. And again, we have one high point here, produced by wind. Yes, well done. So this is on the northeast side, so that southwest dominant wind was active for some of the time, latter part of the eruption, probably from this vent in here, and the scoria mainly landed there in that latter time. You can see we've got one crater here completely surrounded by scoria, and we have 2 here that are U-shaped, or horseshoe-shaped if you like, called breached craters. I got that. There we are, 2 breached craters. And so they're open on their down hillside down here to the archery and down here to the observatory. And that's produced, we believe, by lava coming up inside the vent, pushing its way through the loose scoria and flowing out and taking this side of the scoria cone away and rafting it off on top of the lava flow that flowed out. And the similarly here. And there may have still been more lava fountaining out of this vent while the lava was pouring out, and the scoria that landed on top here continued to be rafted away, and thus we call them breached craters. A number of Auckland's scoria cones have craters that show that they were also breached. Mount Hobson near here has a breached crater. You all knew that, didn't you? Yes, good. So here's the crater here, and this is where it's breached. Lava poured out from here. Some of it flowed down in this direction towards Newmarket, and some of it flowed the other direction under Market Road towards Omahu Road. And it took this part of the Scoria cone away, and so we have the U-shaped breached crater of Mount Hobson. Here's two more with older photos of them with their breached craters. This is Otara Hill, 1940 vertical air photo. You can see the U-shaped crater here, completely quarried away now, of course. And this one's still there, you can see it, but I thought I'd put in this earlier air photo oblique for you of Mount Victoria in Devonport. And this is the U-shaped crater in here, and it's breached in this direction. The lava poured out from the base of the Scoria cone in here and forms the rocks on the foreshore from the Devonport Wharf all the way to Torpedo Bay. Can you hear me up the back all right? You want me to be louder? And so that took away this part of the Scoria cone here and rafted it off. And part of that was Dudas Hill that used to sit here on the foreshore and has been quarried away. So here, this just gives you a diagram of what's happening there. The lava pushes up, and the scoria being loose and not welded, as the lava comes up inside the vent here, it pushes through the loose scoria and always flows out from around the base of the cone. There are no examples in any of Auckland's scoria cones that I'm using two terms, magma and lava. It's exactly the same stuff, except geologists for some strange reason call it magma when it's under the ground, and as soon as it reaches the surface it's called lava, but it's exactly the same. So the magma pushes up here, but it's never in any of Auckland's scoria cones ever been known to come right up to the top and come over the top. It's always pushed its way through and flowed out as the lava flows around the base. And as in the case of the breached cones, this part of the scoria cone being rafted off with the lava flow. This is what the lava might look like. This is in the Congo, but the next eruption in Auckland could very well see lava flows flowing through and destroying properties, etc. like this. So that second kind of cone that I started introducing there, the shield volcano, has much gentler slopes like Rangitoto. See how gentle that is? About a 10-degree slope and not the 30. Only the very top of Rangitoto here has the steeper slopes of about 30 degrees, and that's the scoria cones on the top. The lower portion of Rangitoto is made up of overlapping lava flows that have all erupted out from the base of the scoria cones here in the centre. So there we can see its shape. You can see, in fact, there are several other smaller bumps on the north and south side, which are remnants of earlier scoria cones that erupted before the last one built the highest portion there. Here's a map of Rangitoto to show you the shape of an unconstrained shield volcano, where there's no topography that it's erupted over or through that has constrained its shape. And so the lava's poured out from all around here and flowed equally in all directions, and we've ended up with this beautiful circular island, Rangitoto. And you can see that the contours are much further apart here than they are in the central scoria cone. And you can just see from that just how much of Rangitoto is scoria cone, just in here, and the vast bulk is the shield volcano made of these overlapping lava flows that have poured out. Oops, see, that one. So there's a nice little aerial of some of the lava flows on Rangitoto that haven't yet been covered by the Pukaki forest. And you can see rucking up of the surface of those lava flows as the lava underneath continues to flow down, even though the surface was cooled and a solid crust over the top. So moving down, it was rucking up the crust on the surface. So you can see immediately the direction in which the lava was flowing in these different flows down through here. Another photo of Rangitoto, the flows coming down through here. And as they hit the water, they tended to break into a number of smaller lobes, break through the skin and come out as a little lobe or a finger. So here we can see these branching fingers of lava that have flowed off into the water. Rangitoto, of course, erupted in the middle of the harbour 600 years ago. It's the youngest volcano in Auckland and the only one that we know has erupted into the sea. And so these features that we see here are largely limited to Rangitoto. Now, the character of the lava flows that we see around Auckland and the way they flowed depends on the temperature at which the magma came out. The hotter the magma, the more liquid it is, the faster it flowed. And with the most liquid of those basalt lavas, if it was flowing down, say, a stream valley, you could probably run quite quickly and keep ahead of it. But for people my age now, the best thing to do is to shoot up the side, get away from it, of course, just like a laha coming down the slopes of Ruapehu. And so with those faster flowing lavas, here we have it here in Hawaii, molten on the inside, but very quickly chilling to a black glass on the outside. And as that molten material on the inside continues to move, again, it rucks up that crust, and we get this ropey texture, convex in the direction in which it's flowing. And on Auckland, we see some examples of this sort of feature, and this kind of lava flow is known by the Hawaiian name pahoehoe. If it's much cooler, that lava that comes out, the lava is much more viscous and flows more slowly. It has time to develop a much thicker carapace or crust around the molten material on the inside, but because it's still flowing, that thick crust is still slowly being turned over and broken up. We end up with this very pile of angular blocks, very sharp blocks on the outside, as you can see here, which is the crust that's been turned over and broken into these sharp pieces here. And it too has a Hawaiian name, A'a, probably named by two little Hawaiian boys in bare feet running across it. When the lava flow comes to a stop, then it starts to cool and solidify, and we get dense basalt formed. As the goes from liquid to solid, it contracts slightly, and we get cooling cracks developed in that basalt. And generally, they are perpendicular to the cooling surfaces, which are the top and bottom of the flow, and so we end up with vertical cooling cracks like this, or columns, columnar jointed lava, if you like. This is an example, of course, from the Mount Eden prison quarry in the Auckland Grammar Grounds. The character of the lava flows depends also on the character of the topography in which they were erupted. If in the case of Rangitoto, or lava erupting on the Manukau lowlands, where there's no valley system, generally it just spread out as an apron right around the volcano and eventually produce a circular volcano, gently sloping shield volcano if you get enough. If they erupted on the isthmus, which was largely a dissected system of small valleys and ridges, the lava would get into the stream valley and flow down the stream valley. And here we have the example of the longest lava flow in Auckland, Meola Reef or Westmere Reef, or many other names it's got. And we used to think it came from Three Kings, and some thought it came from Mount Eden and Mount Albert, but now we know it came from Mount St John. So that's something like 12 kilometres back to the source in Mount St John. And I know you're disbelieving because you can't see how there would be a valley system from Mount St John through here to Point Chev, but I can assure you Mount Eden erupted afterwards. And so that valley system that used to exist has now got Mount Eden sticking right in the middle of it. So the shield volcanoes that are produced by these lava flows, another one is One Tree Hill. You don't often see this view, but you can see that these are the lava flows from One Tree Hill coming right down to the foreshore of Onehunga, producing the slopes. That is a less regular shield volcano than Rangitoto, and it too, of course, is capped by the Scoria cones. And the other one is a half shield volcano, if you like, McLennan's Hills. This is the Scoria cones here. Who doesn't know where McLennan Hills are? Oh, well, that's because they're quarried away. The place you might know is just these little outcrop here of basalt that I'm pointing to right there on the left-hand side. Can you all see that? That's Tip Top Corner on the Southern Motorway. Okay, so the Southern Motorway now comes, hang on, I apologise, that's Tip Top Corner there. The Southern Motorway comes from Mount Wellington Highway up here and then down here. So as you come up from Mount Wellington Highway, you're climbing up the slopes of the shield volcano, then you go down to the sea again here, down the other side of the shield volcano. And these Scoria cones have been quarried away, and this is part of that shield volcano lava flow field here, the Panama Road Peninsula that extends into the Tamaki Estuary here. So we've looked at the cones in Auckland, the Scoria cones and the shield volcanoes. And in recent times, 4 additional volcanoes have been recognised here in Auckland, but none of these have been volcanic cones. We'd obviously been able to recognise all those. All the newly recognised volcanoes are, in fact, an additional form of volcano that we haven't yet talked about, explosion craters surrounded by tough rings or cones. Rather like this beautiful example here, Crater Hill in Papatoe. This is the explosion crater here, and then the slopes coming around here are the tough cone, or sometimes if it's much smaller we call this a tough ring. But let's explain that. Again, by how was this formed? It was formed by a different style of eruption from the fire fountaining. It was formed by a wet style of eruption. The fire fountaining was dry, there was no water involved. In this style, water was involved. Usually it's the first style of eruption of most of Auckland's volcanoes. It's when that molten magma is coming up towards the surface, and as it gets towards the surface, it often encounters cold groundwater or surface water. And you can imagine 1,000-degree magma hitting cold groundwater or cold water. What's likely to happen? It's like you've got a pan of hot oil on the stove here, as I often have, and I often spill water as I go past for some reason, and I jump backwards as it explodes back in my face. Any of you had that experience? If you have, you'll remember it. I tell you. Yes, exactly the same thing happens here. As that hot magma hits the cold groundwater, you get explosive blasts. The surface of that rising magma is fragmented by those blasts into fine ash that's blasted in the air, and also the overlying country rock, the sandstone that it's coming up through, is blasted and broken up into many fragments of ash that are thrown into the air with that explosive blast. More water comes in, hits the hot magma, and we'll get another exploding pulse. So we get pulsating explosive eruptions from this volcano until all the groundwater is used up. Those explosive blasts produce an explosion crater, big circular explosion crater, and the ash and clumps that go in through the air land around the vent, building up layers of wet ash. And as those layers of wet ash gradually dry out, they become a fairly hard rock, which we call tuff. Maybe it's a tuff rock, Tuff. So that's why we call it a tuff cone or a tuff ring surrounding the explosion crater. We'll pass that one round. So those ash particles may be quite fine, but they may also be almost pea-sized. And the larger they are, the closer they fall to the vent itself. Here's an example of one of these explosive eruptions, this time through the sea at Surtsey a few decades ago. This is the sort of initial eruption we can expect from Auckland's volcanoes when they first break through the ground if they encounter water, and in most instances we expect they will. The cloud of ash that goes high into the air, got a lot of ash and gas in it. Often it will collapse very quickly back down to the ground under this pull of gravity, and as it hits the ground it blasts it out sideways. And so we get sideways surges called pyroclastic flows. And I'm sure you've all seen an example of one of those in the gallery at the front of the museum, haven't you? And that's what one of those would look like, and we expect the possibility of having one of those or two from the next eruption in Auckland, and that pyroclastic flow may flow out for distances of 2 to 5 kilometres from the vent and largely incinerate and destroy all life that it encounters because it's been an extremely hot mixture of gas and ash, asphyxiating and burning. Only the major structures might survive. So that's the most dangerous phase of any Auckland eruption, and usually it might be the very first phase. So what do these explosion craters look like today? Well, we all know Aoraki Basin here. Here's the explosion crater, and surrounded by this low rim of bedded ash, the tuff, called the tuff ring around it. In Auckland, we recognise still the remains of 30 explosion craters and tuff rings. Here's some more examples here. Pukewairiki, now in the Highbrook Industrial Estate on the edge of the Tamaki Estuary, Panmure Basin, and here at Northcote, Rangitoto and Tank Farm. Here's an example of the bedded ash, the tuff here, that's being handed round. You can see the layers of ash in here. Each layer represents one of those explosive blasts that came out. There may be a few minutes, a few hours between each explosive blast. But this pile here could have accumulated in a matter of 6 hours to a couple of days. All right. And here we've got an example of sometimes larger blocks of material. Often the country rock of sandstone is blasted out by those explosions, goes high in the air, and may drop back and land in the layers of soft ash at the time. And here we get the impact depression of one of those bombs as it's landed in the soft ash. Some more of these explosion craters. The three on the north shore between Takapuna and Northcote, Pukaki, Tank Farm and Rangitoto, all in a very straight line. Gives us good confidence that maybe the magma itself is coming up along a fault line there, a line of weakness through the rocks, and the magma found its way to the surface up that zone of weakness. Here's another one. This is St Heliers or Glover Park. Not quite as easy to recognise in here, but here's the tuff ring going right round here. If any of you live at St Heliers, the water tower here is right on the crest of the tuff ring above it as it goes round. This is what they look like, of course, in the modern topographic maps, which of course Hochstetter and Heathfeed didn't have available to them. In fact, even Searle and Kermode didn't have available what we have available to us today, and I think that's what we're coming to, is that the reason we didn't recognise these other explosion craters until recently is that we didn't have contour maps down to 1.5 metre contouring. Here's the contouring of two of the larger ones, however, Pukaki Lagoon and Crater Hill, between Papatoetoe and the airport. You can see the circular shape of the explosion crater, you can see the very steep inner sides of that crater, and much gentler slopes on the outside of the tuff cone here, and same here. Here's the crest of the tuff cone, and the gentle slopes that we were seeing there, and the crater on the inside, generally with slightly steeper slopes. Steeper slopes on the inside, often because some of that tuff ring or tuff cone slumps or collapses back into the explosion crater soon after it's built up, while it's still wet. And in fact, in some places we can see scallops like this, where this portion of the tuff cone is slumped back into the crater early on. This is Pukaki Lagoon explosion crater, the one I was showing you on the left. You can see very steep, almost cliff sides in some places, where some of this tuff cone slid back into the crater early in its formation. Here's the tuff cone slopes all the way around here. This is the crater that you see as you come into land at Auckland Airport when you're coming in from the east. Look out the right-hand window. It's one of the best craters to see in Auckland, as you can see there. The other thing about recognising these craters is that often they've got a flat floor. Why do you think they've got a flat floor? Here's the answer. Because after they were erupted, they generally accumulated fresh water and became a freshwater lake. That's because the tuff is generally waterproof, if you like. It lines the inside of the explosion crater, and water can be contained within it to build up a lake. The craters in the Scoria cones, the Scoria is loose, the water generally will just flow right through, and so we don't get any lake in them. So the explosion craters, as far as we know, they all became freshwater lakes. And so we have the Pukaki Lagoon example here. Between 70,000 and 8,000 years ago, it was a freshwater lake like this. And on the floor of that freshwater lake, it slowly accumulated lake sediment, building up the floor. In the case of a number of them that are at fairly low altitude, when sea level rose up to its present level after the end of the last ice age, it breached the lowest part of the sill of a number of these explosion craters, and the lake got invaded by the sea. Here it is here, about 7,000 years ago, Pukaki Lagoon got invaded by the sea, and the sea, every tide, brought a lot of mud in suspension into that explosion crater, and mud very quickly filled up the rest of the lake there. Filled it up with mud. In the case of Pukaki Lagoon, in 1,000 years, it built up 30 metres of mud. Filled it right up to the intertidal. And in the next 6,000 years, intertidal mud built up as the sediments underneath gradually compacted down and creating space for that mud to accumulate in. And that's the same story with the other 8 or 9 explosion craters that got breached by the sea 7,000 years ago when sea level came up to its present level. So here's another example of one of those. This is Te Hopua at Onehunga. This was the Onehunga boat harbour. It was mostly intertidal, just a small area of deep channel in here, and this is where it breached the tuff ring that goes around here. But in the 1930s, it was reclaimed, and now it's Gloucester Park, with the motorway to the airport going right through it. So this is Mangere Bridge, and the old Mangere Bridge here by the Onehunga Wharf. Again, we can recognise it by the raised tuff ring around it and the flat floor, even though it has been reclaimed. Now, a number of these explosion craters, the supply of magma stopped while it was still wet, and that's why we've got the entire explosion crater filled up with fresh water and then sediments. But in other instances, it used up all the ground, all the water was used up, but there was still magma coming to the surface. So we still got further eruptions, and the style switched to fire fountaining, dry eruption. And so we had fire fountaining out of the vent in the middle of the explosion crater, building up a scoria cone, or complex of scoria cones. So a number of our explosion craters have small scoria cones in the middle, a classic, what we call castle surrounded by a moat situation. And in the case of some of our biggest scoria cones like Mount Eden and One Tree Hill, we don't see any evidence of an explosion crater and tuff ring. They're probably there, but they're probably buried by the scoria cone which grew too big and completely buried the explosion crater underneath it. After the scoria cone was built and magma stopped being supplied, then sometimes the moat filled up with water as a circular lake around the scoria cone, and that then filled up with sediment. And we'll go out and have a look at an example of that just outside the museum, hopefully soon. So here's another example of one of those. This is Mount Richmond, near Otahu. Here's the explosion crater going right round here with the tuff ring, and built up in the middle is this complex of small scoria cones that we now know as Mount Richmond. Three Kings is another. It had quite a complex of scoria cones in the middle there, far more than three. There were 5 big ones and many smaller mounds. Here it was in 1868, 1920 as we quarried into them, and just Big King sits there today. This is Three Kings from the air in 1940 to show you the outline of the explosion crater and tuff ring. It's the largest explosion crater in Auckland. This is the crest of the tuff ring coming here along. This is Landscape Road and St Andrews Road. Here it is coming along here, along St Andrews Road, across Mount Albert Road along here, and then here you can see the crest of it crossing back. McCulloch Avenue now runs down the side of it there and comes right round to here. This part has been breached, but that's the size of the explosion crater. Here are the scoria cones in the middle as they're being quarried, and this is the moat, if you like, that was around the edge of them, and which is flat floored, as you can see, with all the houses on it in this vicinity towards Three Kings School. There it is from the air today. You might say, I can't see it there. Anybody see it there? It's quite obvious with this semicircle here of McCulloch Avenue, the tuff ring here, coming around here. You can see the trees here outlining it on the Landscape Road side. Here's Big King right here, and all those other scoria cones in the middle that have been quarried away. Mangere Lagoon explosion crater was another. Here it was originally with its small scoria cone in the middle of the explosion crater. It was decapitated and used as sludge ponds by the sewage works, and has more recently been restored with its small scoria cone in the middle again. So all of Auckland's volcanoes produce those different styles or shapes of volcanoes that we can recognise. It depends on whether there was water involved, and it depends how much magma was supplied. In some instances, the magma supply stopped and we just got left with the explosion crater supplied by the tuff ring. But if there was more magma, we got the scoria cone. And if more magma again, lava may have poured out from around the base of the scoria cone as lava flows, as we see in the case of Motocoria. So with Motocoria, the explosion crater was here. And we have remnants of the tuff ring going around here and the moat in between here. The scoria cones and some of the rafted scoria here, and the lava flows that flowed out from the base extend 1 to 2 kilometres out under the sea, out to the south and west. The newly recognised volcanoes. Right. How did we recognise them? I'll see if I can skip through this quite quickly. The first one is Grafton Volcano. It has no particular volcanic form for a Hochstetter Heaphy to see. There was, however, a small scoria cone right here, which forms the nucleus of Outhwaite Park. You all know Outhwaite Park over there? Slightly higher area here, and you go down the hill down here into Park Avenue. This was recognised right from the early days as a small scoria cone, but it was thought to be part of the Domain volcano. Boreholes in the 1990s and 2000s, however, have changed our understanding of Outhwaite Park and showed that, in fact, it erupted erupted before the Domain volcano and is part of another separate volcano that underlies the suburb of Grafton. We'll skip there. Here you see, for example, this is Les Commode's map, the Domain scoria cone surrounded by its tuff ring and tuff extending right over Grafton, but no volcano in there. These are some of the boreholes that we have information on. We put all that data together, and it provided considerable supporting evidence for another volcano underneath Grafton in here. Here we have the contours, and it was partly from these new LiDAR contours that I was able to recognise features of the earlier volcano. The first thing is a flat floored perched valley that Park Avenue is sitting in here. See how flat floored it is all up right through here? And it's sitting up here well above the stream. How the heck did you get this flat floored valley up here? Here's Uthwaite Park Scoria Cone. And on the other side we've got this semicircular or partly circular arc of a ridge here. It all looks reminiscent of the domain. Scoria Cone in here, flat floored crater floor surrounded by an arc, doesn't it? Scoria Cone, flat floored crater floor surrounded by an arc. And so if we put on that, there's another mound over here as well that turns out to be scoria underneath the hospital. So there appears to be two scoria mounds with the moat in here surrounded by an arcuate tuff ring. And with many boreholes underneath the hospital here, we can see that stratigraphy of the tuff ring on this side and the basalt lava-filled crater floor on this side. There it is from an aerial. So this is the crater of the Grafton Volcano in here and its two scoria cones that was later intersected in part by the eruption of the Domain volcano. And there's a cross-section I've done of it to show the Grafton Volcano here and its explosion crater throwing ash out in all directions. Its scoria coming up in the middle, producing the scoria mound under here. And then later on the Domain volcano came up right next to it with its explosion crater throwing out ash, and a lot of that ash mantled the Grafton volcano. And I think it's this mantling by this ash from the Domain that hid the Grafton volcano from view for so long. And there, of course, is the Domain scoria cone that came up afterwards. So there we have the overlapping Grafton and then later Domain volcanoes. The other volcanoes that we've recognised recently are down in the south, an area that Hochstetter's and Heaphy, of course, mapped early on. But Hochstetter's map differs from Heaphy's. It's got a whole lot of additional craters, these things here, shown on it that Heaphy didn't show. Heaphy showed this one here, Pukaki Lagoon, Crater Hill, and showed Kohuora in here, but didn't show this one, this one, this one, or this one, or this scoria here. Recently we went out there to check out these particular identified volcanoes, which later geologists have all ignored and said didn't exist, weren't volcanoes. I also looked at the modern contours, and we concluded that none of these were in fact volcanic centres or volcanoes. The most they probably were freshwater marshes or swamps. And reading Hochstetter's diary, it appears he just climbed to the top of Mount Mangere and went on down through here and then back again and never actually walked over this area. So he probably saw them from the top of Mount Mangere, freshwater swamps, and said, freshwater swamps, depressions must be craters, and put them in his map. So those don't tend to exist. This is the contours we looked at. But looking at the contours all over South Auckland, Manukau lowlands, the search turned up something quite unexpected. It turned up evidence of some other craters that nobody had seen or recognised before. Quite small, but here at Puhanui Reserve, down next to Wiri, we recognised initially two craters here, one with a pond in it. You can see the shape of the tuff ring coming around, right round it, and it's on the top of this hill. And another one down here, a depression with a tuff ring right around it on this side here. And later on, we can recognise a third one. You can see the arc there, and the arc coming right round here of the third, more eroded crater at Puhanui. So we recognise three small explosion craters and tuff cones at Puhanui that had never been seen before. Here they are on a Google map, and you can see exactly where they are, can't you? It's so obvious. I'd walked over it 5 times before I came to doing this and never thought, what is this depression doing at the top of the hill here? Here's the pond one, here's the arena one, and the eroded one in here. This is the Puhanui, and there we have them there. This has got the arena in it now with the tuff ring around it, and this is the eroded one that's got the stream overflowing from the freshwater lake here, coming down and eroding out the eroded crater down in here. Here's the pictures of them on the ground. You can see the tuff cone rising above the level of the terrace in here, of the arena crater, and with its depression, the crater depression in here. And we've cored down in the inside of that crater down here, and we found lake and freshwater swamp deposits inside the arena crater, proving that it was a lot deeper than it is now. There's the pond crater here near the entrance to Puhanui Reserve. That's the crest of the tuff ring going right around it. Here it was back in 1959 before the development of the park, and you can still see it was a pond there sitting on the top of the hill. And here you can see the contours again. Sits on the top of the hill, quite a big depression surrounded by this tuff ring. There it is there, and you can see the lovely tuff ring or tuff cone going up to the top here, and the craters in the top here with the pond in it. So that's those Puhonui craters here, quite close to the remnants of McLaughlin's Mountain and Wiri Mountain Scoria Cone here in southern Auckland, the southern part of the Auckland volcanic field. While we were doing this, I particularly focused on an area up here that's now covered in houses at Papatoe, because I know Ernie Searle recognised a crater up there that nobody subsequently has wanted to recognise. And you can clearly see it's a crater. Anybody not believe me? I mean, there it is. You all would have put it there, wouldn't you? Here's the tuff ring going right round here. It's cut by the southwest motorway now, and it got quite a depression in here. But in preparing the subdivision for housing, they would have bulldozed quite a bit of the tuff ring off and filled up more of this depression in here. But we can still see it in the modern contour maps. Here it is here, this depression surrounded on both sides by the tuff ring around here. It's been breached to the south as the freshwater lake in here overflowed and flowed down here. So I believe Searle got it right, and Cemetery Crater is another volcano in Auckland. And here's Searle's map here, in here, labelled Cemetery Crater, just to the south of Kohuora, Crater Hill and Pukaki down here. And finally, this is the Mangere area of the Manukau lowlands. These are the identified volcanoes we know in this area: Pukaki Lagoon, Crater Hill, Kohuora, over here in Otahu, and over Mangere Mountain, Mangere Lagoon. There's a big area in here that don't have any mapped volcanoes, although Hochstadt had mapped those additional ones in these flat or low-lying swamp areas in here, hadn't he? But looking at the contours, something showed up in Favona in here, in an area that was way out the back of a farm until recently when the subdivision was put in. Now it's Boggis Park, is what it's named as. There it is here. And here's the contours on Boggis Park, from which I recognise that we possibly had another volcano explosion crater. You can see the semicircular shape of the ring right around it, the flat floor here of the park, and the fairly steep slopes surrounding it in here. And out here we've got an arm of the Mangere arm of the Manukau Harbour coming in here. The floor of the Boggis Park, or this depression, is 5 metres above mean high water, above the tide line here, and it's flat. And I suggest that we know that during the last interglacial, the last warm period, sea level was 5 to 6 metres higher than present. And I suggest that this area here has been breached by the sea during the last interglacial 120 to 130,000 years ago, and filled up with sediments, intertidal sediments from the harbour, to give it that flat floor that's now 5 metres above present level of the sea. And that this would have been the former extent of the tuff ring around this explosion crater. Boggis Park explosion crater, here it is here today. You can see that flat floor, and Hugh there is standing on the crest of the tuff ring. And we put down 1 or 2 holes there just to see what the stratigraphy like in the crater floor. Oh, and also we looked at a small cutting up here on the top of the tuff ring, full of tough small clasts of Waitemata sandstone that had been thrown out to prove that the ring around it was indeed built by ash. We put down these cores. We found in the middle quite a lot of marine sediment underneath the fill that was here, and on the side of the crater floor we also found evidence of is that the one there? Here. Evidence of a beach that had been inside the crater when sea level was 5 or so metres higher than present about 120,000 years ago. So we're now confident, in fact, that this is one of Auckland's older volcanoes. The oldest are somewhere around 250,000 years, but this predates 130,000 years and has been breached by the sea at that time. And so this is now what the map of the volcanoes in southern Auckland looks like. Here's Boggis Crater filling that gap where we didn't previously have evidence of a volcano, Cemetery Crater down here, and Puhonui craters down in the south. And that's how our map of Auckland's volcanoes looks like today. I won't promise it'll look like it tomorrow. How many volcanoes? You count. There's no rhyme nor reason, no pattern to the sequence and location of the vents. For example, the youngest is in the north, Rangitoto. The oldest we know is right next to it in the north at Pukaki and Onipoto. So just from those two bits of evidence, it's not showing that it's moving north, for example, which some people like to suggest. We know that 5 erupted all at the same time 32,000 years ago, and they were spaced right throughout the field. So we do believe that the next one will come up somewhere within or close to the extent of the presently known field. So somewhere between Pigeon Mountain in the east and Mount Albert in the west and Pukaki in the north and Wiri or McLaughlin's in the south. But apart from that, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. And the next question, when will it be? Again, there is no pattern to the timing. The last one was 600 years ago, the one before that 10,000 years ago. But we know that half of them erupted in a space of 5,000 or 6,000 years, around 30,000 years ago. So they were spaced quite close together, and as I said, 5 came out together. So we can't say that there won't be another one now for 9,400 years, which is the spacing between Mount Wellington and Rangitoto. We can't in fact say that it won't be next week. Hopefully it will be in my lifetime, but it's unlikely, I guess. So what I was talking about is the domain volcano. We don't know its age. And in fact, I didn't get time to tell you all about the ages, but we don't know a precise age for over half the 53 volcanoes that we now recognise. We have got some more precise modern ages from more modern radiocarbon dating from a number of the volcanoes, but radiocarbon dating doesn't give you accurate ages older than 40,000 years. And to do radiocarbon dating, which is the main method that gives you the more precise ages, you need bits of wood or shell that have been killed or buried and were living at the time the volcano erupted. So you've got to find a bit of wood underneath a lava flow that was charred and killed by the eruption, for example. Anyway, here there was such a tree underneath the building over there when they did excavations, and colleagues of mine when I was working here sent it off for radiocarbon dating and it came back as older than 50,000 years. So I guess we can say, yes, we know that the domain is probably older than 50,000 years, but how much older we don't know. Some of the other volcanoes we can get an idea of the age by drilling the sediment that accumulated in the freshwater lake that was in the crater. So if you carry on down through, you can recognise rhyolitic ashes that came from the centre of the North Island by their distinctive chemistry, and can say, oh, we've just hit the Rotoahu ash at this age, etc. as you go down. You can also then work out the sedimentation rate. Generally it's mostly the shells of diatoms, a small algae, and it's a very slow sedimentation rate. And by combining the ashes and the sedimentation rate, you can project an age for the base of the lake that you've drilled, which gives you a minimum age for the age of the explosion crater. So for Pukaki Lagoon, you heard me say 70,000. That's the minimum age at the bottom of the crater there that they got by drilling. And there are a few other geochemical methods for dating that give less precise ages, and that's where we get the 240 to 200,000 year ages on Onipoto and Pukaki, and Pukaki. All right. We don't know obviously the age of Grafton Volcano, except it was older. I've been able to look at a contact between the material erupted from Grafton Volcano and that erupted from the domain, and there is no evidence there of any development of a forest or vegetation, so or any weathering between the two. The initial eruption here of the domain, as you can see, is an explosion crater surrounded by this tough ring. We're on the crest of the tough ring over here. The museum here goes right round, you know, the ring underneath the pine trees, over behind the grandstand, and underneath the hospital on the far side. You can see the low portion of the tough ring over here on the right. It would have naturally been low, but that's also partly eroded and breached by the runoff of the water that's flown out and down the stream down there, as you know. There's another little saddle over in where the road goes out to Carlton Gore Road. Why was it a couple of years between the two volcanoes? Because the first phase of the eruption here was wet. The last phase of the eruption in the Grafton volcano was dry. So it had used up all the water. It was fountaining to produce the Scoria cones. And what I didn't tell you there is a lot of lava poured out from the base of the Scoria cones at Grafton and flowed in and filled the floor of the crater, forming a lava lake. And that's what we encounter when we drill a lot of holes in Park Road and under the medical school, is a lot of thick lava. In fact, over 50 metres thick in places, this lava lake that filled up the crater floor there. It didn't actually, in that instance, there's no evidence that a lake formed, it just was filled up with the lava immediately. So that was all dry. This erupted, so I suspect in the case with here, magma came up the same route towards the surface as the Grafton, but when it got near the top, it encountered solid basalt that had cooled and congealed in the plumbing underneath Grafton, and it diverted and came up fairly close, 500 metres away, to erupt here. And it hit a lot of groundwater because we've had a huge explosion crater, so there was a lot of groundwater that flowed in. The Grafton crater extended almost across to where the Scoria cone is now. So when that eruption came up, it intersected the edge of the Grafton explosion crater that was filled with basalt. The basalt had cooled, it was full of lots of joints, and so if it had been there a few years, rainwater would have filled in all the joints and it would have been the crater would have been full of water. I suspect that may have been the water that could have caused the explosive style of eruption here until it used up all that water that was there and it switched to the fire fountaining. But we only had a small amount of lava producing the small cone in the middle here, but quite a lot of the lava that came up in that latter phase didn't have too much dissolved gas, and so we got a lot of the lava pouring out as lava flows into the crater. And so in fact the domain moat here is underlain by a lava lake as well, and there is evidence from cores in Carlton-Gore Road down to Newmarket that a lava flow went over the little saddle there that is the gateway at Carlton-Gore Road and flowed down almost to Broadway. And later there was flows from Mount Eden came in over the top of it, but it flowed down there. When I used to work here, I always wondered, why did we have two levels of playing field here? Everybody's aware of the two levels of playing field? Nobody, anybody not aware of it? You can, well, if I came over here so I could see where it goes along and then drops down quite steeply to the lower level. With the drill holes that went in more recently, one or two were put in during the water shortage in the mid-90s, we now have the answer. Right here, we've got fill of about 2 metres overlying basalt lava, the lava lake. So the lava lake is close to the surface, all underneath this area here. Would have been somewhat irregular, but over the surface. Down there on the lower part in front of the grandstand, there's about 10 metres of peat, freshwater swamp and lake peat. And so in fact, the level of that field was 10 plus the level about 15 metres lower than the surface here. And then it goes into the basalt lava lake, the surface of it. And it would seem to me that the obvious explanation is that we got the crater filled up with lava lake and it cooled here more quickly and solidified, but the lower parts in the far side were still molten, and when the supply stopped, some of it went back down the vent, draining the underneath part of that area, and that surface of that lava lake collapsed. And that's well known. We get example of that at Three Kings as well. Some of the lava lake being sucked back down the vent at the end of the eruption and dropping the level. And so that filled up with fresh water, and finally over more than 60,000 years of swamp it's developed, and of course they've now been drained and had fill added in them to make them nice playing fields. The water situation here, much of Auckland's early water supply came from Auckland's volcanoes. That might sound a bit odd, but it's because the scoria, for example, of the Scoria cones is loose, so any rainwater goes into them. If it's contained within an explosion crater here, like this, it'll be full of water in between all the Scoria class. Similarly with the lava flows and the lava lake, full of those cooling cracks, all the water is in the cooling cracks. In here, we have a big pond of fresh water inside the explosion crater beneath the Scoria cone in the fields. And that fills up and flows out, overflows at the level of the duck ponds. All right, so the level of that groundwater is the level of the water in the duck ponds pretty much. And then when you have a lot of rain, of course, the duck ponds overflow and go down there. And during the water shortage, they put down a borehole right by the changing sheds down there, and sure encountered that groundwater. I'm not sure whether they're using that, but the hospital's using groundwater from over just inside the explosion crater on their side, where they've got a big borehole down there, and they use water from this water supply here for the hospital. And the first water supply for Auckland City, of course, came from the duck ponds, came from the source here, piped from here to Queen Street. And much of the early water supply came from Auckland's volcanoes until about 1900. From here it moved to Western Springs, which is the water coming down inside the lava flows down the stream valley from Mount St John, Mount Eden, Three Kings and Mount Albert, and bubbles up as springs at Western Springs. So that's volcanic rock sourced water. And if you go all around the volcanoes, you will find drill holes and water supplies. Lake Pukaki supplied all of the North Shore, Devonport, Takapuna, Northcote, Birkenhead boroughs at different times. Drill hole at Pigeon Mountain went in right next to the Scoria cone inside the explosion crater. Drill hole at Mount Mangere, drill hole at McLaughlin's Mountain. All of those went inside the explosion craters into the Scoria cone and got the water to supply the different boroughs. Onehunga, of course, the major water supply for Onehunga, One Tree Hill, Mangere over periods of time, are the springs coming up from the lava flow field, the shield volcano of One Tree Hill. Water from One Tree Hills all goes down and feeds those springs. As the water goes down, the seawater comes in from sea level through the cracks, and the lava flows is more dense. The fresh water goes above the salt, and bubbles up right at sea level there. I should say that all of Auckland's volcanoes have ever only erupted once, except Rangitoto, and that seems to have been only 10 to 50 years apart, and I think we had the same thing there as happened here. The immediate plumbing beneath the first vent of Rangitoto, the northern cone, had congealed and solidified. The second lot of magma coming up only a decade or a few later came up the same route and hit that congealed plumbing, block plumbing, and deviated and come up quite near it. All the others, that plumbing for some distance down obviously solidified. Next time another batch of magmas come up, it's hit all the block plumbings and found a new way to the surface through fractured rock, etc. And so we get a new volcano erupted. So I should have said, when someone asked the question, where will the next eruption be? Somewhere that doesn't already have a volcano on it, but it could be quite close to one existing one, couldn't it?